Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm really pleased to be here this evening and to talk to you about this. This evening I want to explore with you some of the barriers that will ultimately constrain the government's ability to attain the net zero goal. I'm going to approach the issue from the perspective of a retired energy economist who has worked, as was noted before, for about 27 years working on climate, energy, and environmental issues. And I'm hoping desperately that you will, I did that, of course, for the federal government. I'm hoping desperately that you will not hold that against me. For those of you who like to get to the bottom line right away, my thesis is that the implementation of the present and planned measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions will have such strong adverse effects upon the Canadian economy and on people's lives that ultimately people will rebel against it. There will arise such a strong protest that governments will be forced to adopt a U-turn in policy. In order to change that, we have to change public perceptions. That will be the key. There's no doubt in my mind that because of the magnitude of the adverse effects, the Canadians will come to realize that they're not worth incurring. And the only question, though, is one of timing. And I'm not really sure when that will be. So what does net zero really mean? Essentially, it means eliminating almost all of the greenhouse gas emissions that are produced as a result of our consumption of hydrocarbons, oil, natural gas, and coal in the Canadian economy, and doing so in 27 years, by 2050. The net in that title is a reminder that in some instances, allowances will be made for the offset to purchase of carbon credits and sequestering or storing carbon dioxide in various ways. This obviously represents an enormous challenge. Canadians now rely on oil, natural gas, and coal for about 73% of our energy needs. And they provide our services that are essential for our quality of life. Secure, reliable, and affordable heat, lighting, and motive power to move people and goods, and the food, medicine, and other critical services that sustain us. Without these energy sources, we would all be poorer, colder, less mobile, and less able to compete in the global economy. Yet, all of the major national political parties in Canada support the net zero goal, as do the governments of most provinces, most industry associations, and the media and academia. Basically, they're saying that they agree with the thesis that emissions of carbon dioxide will have catastrophic effects in the long term and will promote severe weather effects in the short term. Most of the time, government efforts to radically change the global or Canadian energy system would result in a considerable amount of public resistance. Today, however, a climate of fear prevails. The public is constantly bombarded with messages that climate change threatens catastrophe, that it will risk the extinction of the human race, or the end of civilization as we know it. Anyone who dissents from that is, of course, condemned and often accused of being a denier, as though that is akin to denying the Nazi Holocaust. Further, by embracing artificial deadlines and emission targets, climate alarmism poses a dangerous pretense of urgency. We're told that there's not enough time for deliberation. There's not enough time to experiment. We must get on with it. Everything must be done in a hurry. Many federal politicians are afraid to challenge the perceived climate consensus. When one raises considerations related to economics or engineering or science, most often common reaction of federal politicians is often, that battle is lost. That does not mean that those of us who believe in the value of evidence-based decision-making should stop our efforts. It does mean that we must be realistic about what it may be happen for current policy to become politically untenable. The federal government has elevated reducing greenhouse gas emissions to the preeminent goal of public policy. Its policy framework includes the passage of the Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act. And that act legally binds the government to achieve net zero emissions by 2050 and to set 5-year targets. And of course, it starts with legislation. But the centerpiece, if you will, is carbon dioxide pricing. The government intends that increase the cost of using energy and therefore will theoretically drive us to reduce our use of it. But in addition to carbon pricing, we have regulations, massive amounts of regulations that are intended to restrict the use of emissions, or excuse me, use of hydrocarbons, or impose ever more stringent standards that must be met in terms of different uses, whether it's in vehicles or in appliances or other areas. The government has also implemented dozens of different subsidies in the form of direct grants and contributions, but also tax credits, all to supplement the use of renewable energy and to promote transfers from one form of energy use to another. There's over 400 different energy measures that are now in place to reduce carbon dioxide emissions as implemented by federal and provincial governments. And the Auditor General, federal and provincial Auditor Generals have complained about this and the risk of overlap and duplication, but that has not prevented this. We face every day the prospect of more and more of these programs that are pancaking on top of one another, if you will. In my view, the policy approach that's being taken right now is fundamentally flawed. I had a front row seat in the development of Canadian energy policy over the period from about 1979 to 2006. I can tell you that the number and the intrusiveness of the measures that are being implemented as part of the federal government's climate change policies are so great that they make the 1980s National Energy Program look like a kindergarten exercise by comparison. The centerpiece, of course, is the federal government's carbon dioxide pricing regime. In theory, carbon dioxide pricing is the most economically efficient way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But that's only the case if the design of the system fits the theoretical ideal. And the theoretical ideal essentially involves a complete return of the revenues that are raised back to the public, and avoiding using additional measures such as regulations and subsidies and others. In fact, the Canadian carbon dioxide regime bears no resemblance to that theoretical ideal. It's not revenue neutral. It involves a significant number of additional measures, and as I mentioned, in terms of carbon regulations and subsidies. And it bears no relationship to the alleged costs of climate change. The result is that it's not only damaging in terms of its impact on consumers, but it is significantly damaging in terms of the prospects for Canadian firms that have to compete internationally, because they have to bear the incremental costs of that. And of course, consumers already see the costs of climate taxes and fees, The federal standard levy of $65 per ton is now scheduled to increase in regular segments until it reaches $170 per ton in 2030. And frankly, it will go on much higher than that in the future. The prospects are that it will rise to at least $300 per ton before they will be able to reach the net zero target. Now, that's bad enough, but it's particularly bad in terms of its impact on our competitive position. The rates currently are already far higher than those that are paid by any industries in any of our principal trading partners, the United States, China, and Mexico. The United States, of course, has no national carbon tax, and the one in China is $8 per ton, and that in Mexico is $4 per ton. And that situation will continue, that situation will continue to get worse and worse as the difference between the Canadian carbon taxes and those in other countries widen. To this taxation regime has recently been added the Clean Fuel Standard. Now, the Clean Fuel Standard is really a regulatory program that seeks to reduce emissions from transportation and liquid fuels. The Parliamentary Budget Office did a review of this standard, and their conclusion was that the annual cost of it per household will be about $1,100 a year in Alberta and Saskatchewan, and that across Canada, the burden will fall most heavily upon low-income households. So taxes are only part of the story. Governments have implemented a virtual mountain of regulations. Albertans will be most familiar with Bill C-69, the so-called No More Pipelines Act. And that act politicized the regulation of oil pipelines and oil and gas pipelines in Canada. It doubled the scope of assessment, and it increased the opportunity for opponents of pipelines to harass, to block, to delay the proceedings. And further, that particular act broadened the scope of assessment so that every major new infrastructure in the Canadian economy is subject to review on the basis of whether it meets or contradicts the net zero emission reduction goal. The Supreme Court recently declared that much of the legislation is ultra vires, or contrary to the Canadian Constitution. And especially in the sense that any project that is conducted entirely within a provincial jurisdiction is outside of the jurisdiction of the federal government. But I wouldn't celebrate too loudly over that, to tell you the truth. It left intact the federal government's authority on federal lands and over interprovincial and international infrastructure. It also left intact the fact that federal environmental assessment will continue to apply to any project that receives federal funding. And many, many projects receive federal funding. It's yet to be decided whether projects that receive tax benefits or significant tax credits will be considered to have federal funding and therefore to continue to be subject to the federal jurisdiction over environmental assessment and review. The electricity sector now copes with regulations that ban the use of hydrocarbons by 2035. By that date also, motor vehicle manufacturers must stop selling internal combustion vehicles as far as light-duty vehicles are concerned, which will add thousands of dollars to the cost of purchasing a new vehicle. Regulations regarding emissions intensity standards increasingly limit industry and consumers in terms of their choices across a broad spectrum of consumer appliances. And before long, all modes of transport, including trucks, railways, marine vessels, and aircraft, will be subject to emissions regulations. This will only increase costs and reduce buyers' choices. The pending introduction of a cap-and-trade or supplementary carbon tax system on the oil and gas industry marks a whole new chapter in the regulatory onslaught, I should say. The system seeks to reduce emissions from the industry by 42% by 2030. That target far exceeds what can be accomplished with carbon dioxide capture and storage in that time frame, on the basis of what I've been advised. Many of you know that better than I. It can only be achieved, therefore, by reducing production. The cap will, according to the Montreal Economic Institute, which recently released a study of this, the cap will reduce oil and gas production in 2030 by 789 million to 1.4 billion barrels of oil equivalent. Depending on the scenario, the caps will result in industry financial losses of at least $45 billion per year. Amazingly, no one really knows what the costs of net zero emissions will be. The modeling of costs usually assumes that governments will rely exclusively upon carbon dioxide pricing as their policy mechanism for achieving it, when we already know that they won't do that. The Royal Bank estimated the cost of transitioning the whole economy at about $2 trillion. That's clearly an underestimate. In the 2023 federal government budget, the federal government itself estimated that the expenditures that it would make on climate programs would range from $125 billion to $140 billion per year from now to 2050. That's cumulatively, that's $3.4 to $3.6 trillion. Or $100,000 per person in Canada. The actual federal government expenditures on climate programs over the last 7 years have been $120 billion. Now, that's about $17 billion per year. Let me try to put that in context. There are about 8,000 cities and towns in Canada. With $120 billion, we could have built, equipped, and staffed a brand new hospital in every single one of those communities. Of course, it's hurt investment. Over a 2-year period alone in 2017 and 2018, over $100 billion in investment in the petroleum industry was canceled or disapproved or deferred. Many industrial firms in Canada have either closed or left Canada. I'm a member of the board of directors of the Coalition of Concerned Manufacturers and Businesses of Canada. Half of the companies that are members of that coalition have now moved their operations out of Canada. Half. That's what's happening to our small to medium-sized manufacturing companies. The regulations that are forcing the accelerated phase-out of coal-fired power plants and granting preferential access and rates to renewable energy sources have doubled the residential electricity rates in some provinces. The subsidies paid by federal and provincial governments to renewables and other clean energy firms are also adding to Canada's already inflated public debt and increasing inflation. The economic burden of pursuing net zero is appalling. As you well know, much of that burden has already fallen on Alberta and Saskatchewan. But the emissions-intensive industries that are affected competitively by the carbon taxes are spread right across the country. And they include mining, metal fabrication, petrochemicals, cement, steel, heavy manufacturing, and pulp and paper. About 600,000 people are employed directly or indirectly in the petroleum industry in Canada. But the number of people that are employed in the emissions-intensive and trade-exposed industries that will be adversely affected by carbon taxes is far larger than that. What's happening is that Canada is de-industrializing to the advantage of Asia. Some of the best-paying jobs we have in the country are being lost as a result. In 2021, the Fraser Institute published the results of its macroeconomic analysis of the effects of carbon dioxide taxes to 2030. They will cause a 1.8% decline in our gross domestic product by that point in time. That works out to about $1,500 per employed person and a loss of about 184,000 jobs in the economy. Now, that estimate refers to the outcome after labor markets have cleared. In other words, taking into account whatever additional jobs may be created as a result of the measures themselves. So it's not a measure of temporary unemployment, but a measure of permanent job losses. Most of the job losses coming from taxes alone will be felt in Ontario and Quebec, a point that the politicians in those provinces clearly have not twigged to yet. A study that was produced by Rystad Energy on behalf of the Canadian Energy Centre projected that under a net zero scenario by 2050, the government's plan would essentially wipe out the net present value of Canada's oil sands holdings. Wipe out the net present value of Canada's oil sands holdings. The capital expenditures in the oil sands would fall from $8 billion in 2022 to under $370 million in 2050. That's a 95% reduction in capital expenditures in the oil sands industry. On a cumulative basis, between 2020 and 2050, almost $720 billion that governments take from the oil sands would be foregone. That will have effects right across the country. Considering the strategic importance of the oil sands, not just to Canada, but to the entire OECD area, that is like shooting ourselves in both feet and then looking around for another tender place to fire. In its recently released discussion paper advocating a just transition, the federal government acknowledged that climate policy will cost us thousands and thousands of jobs. However, it claimed that there would be a tremendous growth of new job opportunities in the so-called clean industry. The evidence says precisely the opposite of that. The studies of actual experience in Spain, Italy, Germany, and England all show that for every job that is created in the renewable energy industries, 2 to 3 are lost in other sectors of the economy because of the effects of higher electricity prices. We have another way of checking on this in Canada. Since 2007, Statistics Canada has kept data on what it calls the clean technology sector. The definition of that sector is very broad. It doesn't just include renewable energy or energy efficiency, but it includes all sorts of other things that are completely unrelated to climate change. The sector in 2007 accounted for 3% of Canadian gross domestic product. In 2021, after more than a decade of massive public expenditure and subsidies, it still accounted for 3%. It's not growing. Then there's the prospect of rising inflation. Many things, of course, cause inflation, and it can be difficult sometimes to fully assess it. But the effects of inflation are easy enough to understand. Inflation is what happens when I spend $30 for a $20 haircut that I used to get for $10 when I had a lot more hair. Okay. But it's more than that. In normal times, energy accounts for about 10% of the cost of most goods and services. So doubling the cost of energy is undoubtedly going to have an inflationary impact on many parts of the economy, particularly those that rely upon transport. The rising cost of housing is another area of special concern. To eliminate all GHG emissions from housing in Canada would require us to have some combination of retrofitting of the existing housing stock, installation of new heating systems like heat pumps, and backup furnaces, and increased insulation. Using estimates of building costs that are provided by the Canadian Home Builders Association, Dr. Ross McKittrick has assessed the cost of the federal government goal to increase the energy efficiency of residential buildings in Canada by about 63% by 2030. While the costs vary across Canada, the average would be about $55,000 per house in Canada. Canada already faces a housing crisis, and young people have lost their ability and, in some cases, their hopes of ever owning a home. Climate policy will make that situation worse. At the root of the climate policy framework is the political elite's distrust of free and competitive markets. In other words, they don't trust the people. The government has initiated a level of central planning and control that is unprecedented in peacetime. In my view, and based upon my experience in government, politicians and officials lack the knowledge and the skills to implement and to supplant the decisions of the marketplace. When individuals and businesses make decisions about what to invest in, what to produce, what to buy, they inevitably make trade-offs. Maybe you want to buy a car that costs less and that can be reliably refueled rather than an all-electric car that will allegedly reduce emissions but will cost you more. Governments increasingly believe that doing that, making such trade-offs, is contrary to the views of the collective. It places the views of the individual against the views of the collective. And it also believes that emissions reduction should be the preeminent consideration in people's buying decisions. The perversity of this situation was illustrated this August when Environment Minister Stephen Guilbeault, after announcing new federal regulations affecting emissions from electricity generation, insisted this had to be applied consistently across the country. And Premier Scott Moe of Saskatchewan replied that instead, Saskatchewan would prefer to stick with its own power generation plant. Guilbeault said that such action could be subject to criminal charges under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. So now emitting carbon dioxide counter to the federal government's policies can get you thrown into jail. Really? Really? This is not just foolish. It's profoundly anti-democratic. Such policies will, thank you. Such policies will be recognized by voters, and they will ultimately reassert their democratic rights to make decisions free from government control. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about global climate collaboration. Many Canadians believe that Canada must do its part in a war, a global war, in which all countries are engaged to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. They ignore the ever-growing divergence between what the United Nations says is required in terms of emissions reduction and what's actually happening in the global marketplace. In fact, the non-OECD developing countries now account for almost 70% of all the greenhouse gas emissions in the world. The developed or wealthier countries are only about 30%. And worse, almost 100% of the growth in emissions is occurring in the developing countries. Any emission reduction commitments that are made by the developing countries are also, under the current international agreements, contingent upon the receipt by the developing countries of enough climate aid in the form of technology and funds from wealthier countries. If we don't pay, they won't play. Now, over the last 3 years, the developing countries have gradually increased their demands for funding. They want $1.3 trillion per year for every year from 2026 to 2030, and more after that. They want, in addition, $600 billion a year for climate adaptation. And last year at the COP conference that took place in Egypt, they indicated that they wanted to have compensation for historic emissions, the so-called loss and damages, whereby the countries of the world that industrialized first and began producing emissions first would have to bear responsibility for any extreme weather events that occurred in the developing countries today. So if there was a serious storm in India or some other developing country, and the damages were significant, countries like Canada would get the bill for the cleanup. The consequences of that in terms of funding are virtually unlimited. In 2022, the wealthier countries of the world gave about $200 billion in traditional foreign economic development assistance. If we were to comply with the demands of the developing countries for climate aid, it would increase foreign aid by 10 times. Let's be clear what this means. The wealthier countries will never agree to pay that much money. The developing countries will therefore consider themselves under no obligation to incur the economic costs that are associated with emissions reduction. Consequently, at the global level, the net zero goals will not be met. Even for climate activists, it should be obvious that Canada cannot save the world all by itself. What happens when the Canadian public finally understands that global emissions will grow regardless of what we do? My starting thesis was that at some point within the next decade, climate policy will hit the wall. I acknowledge that hitting the wall is an imperfect metaphor. It implies that there will be some sudden, insurmountable barrier to further movement. It's equally likely that there will be a series of problems, a series of events that will so concern the Canadian public as to become cumulatively intolerable. Under such conditions, voters might well rebel from current climate policy and vote out of office all of those that are responsible for it. Judging by events in Europe, one can only hope. Boy, it's dry in Alberta. Judging by events in Europe, it takes a severe energy crisis that creates what they call a heat or eat dilemma before the publics will respond this way. Advocates of climate alarm are very skillful in shifting the blame to others, so it's not obvious that this will become clear to the public. So unless we change the discussion, climate policies are very likely to get much, much worse before they get better and do deep, lasting harm to the country. So far, Justin Trudeau believes that his climate policy is making him more popular, especially in Quebec. There, at least, when people wave at him, they use all their fingers. He is, I believe, ideologically committed to net zero policies, and his cabinet backs him up on that entirely. They want to have a fundamental transformation of Canadian society based upon a fairly narrow set of progressive political goals, and of which reducing greenhouse gas emissions is only one. There will be no change in policy as long as they're in office. At present, there's really only one viable alternative to the Liberal New Democratic Party coalition that has governed Canada since 2015, and that's the Conservative Party. But it too, however, has endorsed the net zero hypothesis, and while constantly criticizing the effects of carbon dioxide taxes and favoring the use of taxpayer subsidies to support new technologies like carbon dioxide capture and storage. The party's recent success at the polls will, I believe, make the leadership very shy about taking any positions that will draw severe criticism to them. Anything that the media might condemn as anti-environment or as reactionary or even worse, Trump-like. I doubt, therefore, that the Conservative Party will change its public position on climate before it gains its decisive election victory and can rule with a majority. Even that's uncertain. The other way, potentially, to change climate policy is through the collective efforts of a number of important and active provinces. The recent passage of the Alberta Sovereignty Within a United Canada Act perhaps indicates that the province is willing to contest the enforcement of Canadian legislation where, in its view, it clearly can be demonstrated that it's unconstitutional. As lawyer Andrew Roman has pointed out, however, the Supreme Court of Canada's decision in the carbon tax case set a precedent that the provinces may find it difficult to override. In that decision, the court decided that greenhouse gas emissions represent a pollution problem that is serious and global in scope. This left less room for provincial natural resources jurisdiction. Not one single province contested the claims that global action was needed to fight a climate crisis, or that Canada had committed to emissions reductions in the 2015 agreement, Paris Agreement. Neither of those things are true. But what an omission on the part of the provinces. Or perhaps what an extraordinary demonstration of political cowardice. Canadians will pay dearly for that, and it's very, very unfortunate. In conclusion, do I see an alternative, perhaps more hopeful scenario? At this time, it's very difficult to see one, especially before 2030. After that, the timing of a Canadian U-turn in climate policy will depend upon Canadians' capacity to tolerate lost opportunities and reduce standard of living. I think a U-turn is inevitable, but I worry about how long it will take. Young people in particular seem mesmerized by the prospects that governments might take care of them and that they might be able to own nothing and be happy. My own son said to me that he thought the idea had a fair amount of appeal. So I was puzzled, and I asked him, well, where will you live and how will you get around? And he said, well, I'll move in with you and borrow your car. So now I get it. I mean, it sounds funny, but it's not. This is very serious stuff. The roots of the public divide over climate policy go well beyond ideological differences over the merits of markets versus central planning. For some people, of course, there are billions of dollars to be made by pushing the climate agenda. But for others, what is ultimately at stake are fundamental differences and different perspectives on the really the value of human existence and in relationship to nature. The underlying premises of radical environmentalists are that humans are the enemy of nature, and that economic growth is bad. Further, that the world needs degrowth and depopulation. Confronting these views is an optimist premise. And the optimist premise is that human ingenuity can and will achieve a favorable balance among the world's economic, social, and environmental objectives. And that we should get on, yes, and we should get on with the business of improving the lives of humans. That is an argument that we optimists absolutely must win. Thank you very much.